She went for a weekend by the sea and vanished into the summer night. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. Summer of 1976, during an unusually scorching Irish heatwave. 23-year-old Elizabeth Plunkett, bright, adventurous, midway through a short relationship, sets off from Dublin with friends to Brittas Bay in County Wicklow. A carefree escape. Pubs, laughter, the promise of salty air and laughter by the sea. Come Saturday evening, she's seen in McDaniel's pub. A minor argument erupts among her friends. Elizabeth, ever the peacekeeper, gently intervenes and then walks out alone at around 11 p.m. She heads toward the caravan park. That's the last time anyone sees her alive. By Sunday morning, the mood shifts. Friends grow anxious. Searches begin. But there's silence, no sign, no word, no clue. Just a cruel emptiness. And in that eerie calm, the first thread of a nightmare is woven. The calm panic turns frantic when 4 weeks later, on 29 September 1976, a battered body surfaces on Dunkermick Beach in County Wexford. It's Elizabeth, bound, strangled, and wrapped in seaweed, her final breaths stolen somewhere between the forest and the waves. But shockingly, nobody shouts from the rooftops. No front page headlines scream, "Murder by serial killer." Instead, no death certificate is issued and no official cause of death is ever recorded. The post-mortem report hints she was dead before entering the water, but no one labels it unlawful, no inquest is held, and her death slips into state neglect. So while a grieving family searches for baptismal answers, the system moves on. Elizabeth becomes a statistic, not a tragedy, but her story is far from over. In the same summer of 1976, two British men, John Shaw and Geoffrey Evans, quietly arrive in Ireland. The pair, both in their 30s, are no strangers to violence. Their twisted mission: to satisfy a dark, destructive impulse. Before Elizabeth's body is even discovered, Shaw and Evans are already deep into their gruesome plan. Their targets? Women. Every week they aim to abduct and kill. They make no secret of it. Shaw, a skilled manipulator, and Evans, his violent companion, don't seem concerned about hiding their tracks. Instead, they act with chilling confidence. They hunt, they wait, and eventually they act. In the chaos of the weekend, their sights fall on Mary Duffy, another young woman, whose fate is sealed before she can even see the danger approaching. The two men brutally murder Mary, then travel south to Brittas Bay. Here they encounter Elizabeth. But it's not just their first taste of violence in Ireland, it's their first serial killing spree. The horror they cause will leave an indelible mark on the country's history. They weren't just criminals, they were the first Irish serial killers, and no one saw them coming. By late 1976, Shaw and Evans are arrested in County Cork after attempting to abduct another woman. What follows is a brutal wave of revelations. In Garda custody, the men begin to talk first about Mary Duffy, then chillingly about Elizabeth Plunkett. They confess. In clear, disturbing detail, they describe how they picked Elizabeth up near the caravan park, how they drove her inland, how they strangled her and dumped her body into the sea. And yet they are never tried for her murder. The director of public prosecutions decides to drop all charges related to Elizabeth. The legal term? Nolle prosequi. It means the case is abandoned without explanation. No trial. No jury, no sentence. The men already faced life for Mary Duffy, and the system decided that was enough. But for Elizabeth's family, it was a second death. Her name wasn't mentioned in court. Her suffering wasn't recorded in any verdict. The men who confessed to killing her were never held accountable. The truth was buried, along with the case. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, the case takes a surreal and devastating twist. In the year 1987, more than a decade after Elizabeth's murder, A notorious Dublin criminal named Martin Cahill, known as the General, breaks into a Garda archive. Among the files he steals is the original Plunkett murder file evidence, statements, and investigative notes gone, vanished. It's one of the most critical documents in Elizabeth's case, and just like that, the state has its excuse. Without the file, no further investigation can proceed. Leads go cold. Witnesses drift away. The confession from Shaw and Evans becomes legally irrelevant. The system shrugs and lets the silence grow deeper. For the Plunkett family, this wasn't just a burglary, it was the theft of justice. With the key evidence missing, Elizabeth's name stayed locked in a bureaucratic purgatory. No death certificate, no inquest, no legal closure. Just an open wound rotting behind red tape. While the state forgot Elizabeth, her family never did. For nearly 5 decades, Kathleen and Bernadette Plunkett, Elizabeth's sisters, fought to keep her name alive. They wrote letters to Gardaí, pleaded with the Department of Justice, contacted TDs, and begged for the truth to be acknowledged. Year after year, their efforts were met with silence, closed doors, or polite excuses. They weren't even allowed to speak at parole hearings for Shaw and Evans. Why? Because Elizabeth's murder was never officially recorded. In the eyes of the law, she wasn't considered a victim of their crimes. Imagine it. The killers confessed, the family buried her body, and yet they had no legal standing, no voice. But they never gave up. They pushed for an inquest. They demanded a death certificate. They chased justice not just for Elizabeth, but for all victims buried in silence. And they waited until finally the right voice came along to help break the silence wide open. In late 2024, nearly 5 decades after Elizabeth vanished, a new voice entered the story, a podcast called Stolen Sister, narrated by activist and model Roz Purcell. It wasn't just a show, it was a reckoning. The series pieced together the forgotten fragments of Elizabeth's case. It revealed how the legal system abandoned her, how her killers walked free of her charge, how her family was silenced again and again. And something remarkable happened. People listened. The podcast triggered a surge of attention. The public began to ask, how could this happen in Ireland? Then, in a chilling ripple effect, 8 women came forward. They had encountered Shaw and Evans during the same summer. Some had been followed, others nearly abducted. All had stayed silent until now. Their stories lined up like a pattern in the dark. Suddenly, Elizabeth wasn't just one tragic victim. She was the first in a string of almost victims and a state failure stretching back decades. The podcast didn't just tell a story, it revived an investigation and gave Elizabeth's name back to history. The voices grew too loud to ignore. On a tense afternoon in June 2025, Labour TD Ivana Basic stood before the Dáil and said what no official had dared say for nearly 50 years. Elizabeth Plunkett was murdered and the state failed her. She demanded a cold case review. She called out the institutional inertia. She asked why the Department of Justice had never corrected the wrong, and she stood shoulder to shoulder with Kathleen and Bernadette, who sat in the public gallery, hearts pounding, decades of grief in their eyes. The Taoiseach, under pressure, responded. He promised to speak with the Minister for Justice, promised to act, promised to meet the family. For the first time, the Plunkett sisters weren't alone. The chamber listened. Ireland listened, and the walls of power silent for half a century finally echoed with the name Elizabeth. A new chapter was opening, one that might finally rewrite the ending. Elizabeth Plunkett's murder is not just a tragedy from the past, it's a mirror held up to the present. Her case exposes the cracks in the system, a confessed murder ignored, a stolen file never recovered. A family denied the right to mourn properly, speak legally, or be heard publicly. And it wasn't just about her. The 8 other women who came forward after the podcast Women Nearly Taken, almost silenced, show how many lives danced on the edge of destruction while authorities looked the other way. This case isn't just about justice denied, it's about the cost of silence, the damage done when bureaucracy replaces empathy. And it raises haunting questions. How many other Elizabeths were buried by the system? What happens when a government treats confessions as inconvenience? Who gets to be remembered and who disappears from history? For every second Elizabeth's story went untold, impunity grew stronger. And now Ireland is being forced to look directly at the mess it left behind.